The passage for today will be from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. We'll be reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. I'll read aloud for us. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone else who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge, and then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. So we have finished our series on the book of Job, and today we're going to be starting on a new series on the book of Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes is a book written by Solomon in the latter part of his life, and he's writing it in reflection of his life, both his successes and his failures, things that he's done well, and his shortcomings. And he's reflecting on those things and almost writing like a memoir so that those who will come after him, future generations of leaders who come after him, would read his memoir, would read his letter, and be encouraged both from his success and his failures and learn from it and hopefully grow from it as well. There are some things I want us to understand about Solomon and Ecclesiastes, and it's this. First, Solomon succeeded in many ways. For example, he fulfilled his father David's vision for a temple of the Lord. David had this great dream, this great ambition, this great vision to build a temple for God, a house of the Lord. And it's Solomon himself who is the one who was able to take all the planning and all the resources gathered by his father and help make it into fruition. Secondly is that we know that Solomon was considered the wisest king in Israelite history. Another thing is that during Solomon's reign, there was a time of true peace, meaning that there were no wars, which is not true of anyone else. Right? So during the time that he had reigned, it was a time of true peace. And then finally, Solomon was able to maintain a time of prosperity for the nation of Israel. And because of his wisdom and because of his great wealth, he was also able to bring great fame towards Israel as well. So there are many things that Solomon did exceedingly well and had accomplished. However, at the same time, there are a lot of shortcomings that also need to be acknowledged about Solomon. For example, Solomon married 700 wives and 300 concubines. He had 1,000 people he was married to. I don't know if you understand this. There are 365 days in a year, meaning that he saw each of his wives. If he spent one day with each of his wives, it would take him over 2.5 years to come back to the first wife. Right? This is the almost exceedingly over craziness of his marriages. Also, in his elder age, when he became much older, because many of his wives obviously did not have a relationship with him, and they were lonely and homesick and thinking about their land that they were from, he began to heed their request to bring some of their culture back to Israel. And part of that culture was idolatry. They wanted to be able to worship the gods of their land. And so they pestered Solomon to build them temples where they may go and worship the idols of their land. And so he does so. He builds temples for the idols of his wives. But not only that, we're told that Solomon not only built these temples, but he began to participate in the worship of these idols. And if you ever study the lands from which some of these women were from, you'll find out that some of these idolatry worship included very evil practices, such as human sacrifice. Right? And here is Solomon participating in this kind of evil practice, this kind of evil worship. Finally, is that, look, Solomon built the temple of the Lord. He built castles for himself. He built castles for all of his wives. And now he also builds temples for all of his wives as well. All of this costs so much money. And so we're told that during Solomon's reign, the people were heavily taxed for all of this construction that had occurred, for all of this life of extravagance that Solomon wanted to live for himself and all of his wives and concubines. So at the same time, while there are many things commendable about what Solomon had done, we also have to acknowledge there are many shortcomings as well. And all of all this is what Solomon is reflecting on. He's reflecting on his life, the successes as well as of his shortcomings. And so he writes Ecclesiastes. And as I share with you, it was written during the latter part of Solomon's life. And he's reflecting once again on his successes and his failures. And his intention is not just to complain, is not just to gripe, but is to help future generations of leaders do what? To learn from Solomon. Learn from the things that I've done well, but learn from the mistakes I have done. And I hope that when you read this letter, when you read the book of Ecclesiastes together with me, that's the heart and attitude you would have. That we would learn from the successes as well as to learn from the mistakes and failures of Solomon's life, so that we can continue to grow and to excel in our life of faith. And what's interesting is most scholars will tell you that the book of Ecclesiastes is summarized by one word. And you know what that is? Meaningless. Meaningless. Right? And Solomon will usually tell you that all the things that he had been living for up to that point, he looks back and realizes all of it was meaningless. And I challenge you to take some time to examine our own lives and ask ourselves, what are we doing and why are we doing those things? And whether it's about what you're doing or why you are doing those things, perhaps like Solomon, in reflection, we'll realize that what we're doing might be meaningless, or we might be having meaningless motives. Because that's what Solomon begins to realize as he's processing and reflecting upon his life. And his challenge to you is not to discourage you. It's not to say, I lived a meaningless life, you're living a meaningless life, oh, this is so depressing. But it's to say, I realize that some of the things I've done was meaningless, some of the reasons why I did the things I did were meaningless, and he's challenging us to learn from that and to grow from that. And so I pray that you would not walk away reading the book of Ecclesiastes just being depressed, but you will be challenged and convicted to reflect and to examine what are we living for and why do we do the things that we do. So I wanted to share with you from today's passage, because Solomon is describing his own journey into a process of becoming the wisest person in the world, right? So he's describing this journey that he's going on in becoming the wisest person in the world, and we'll see this from verses 12 to 15, that he mentions several things. Number one is he mentions that he's attained all kinds of knowledge, and he's studied all kinds of cultures and philosophies. So he's saying, I am well studied, I am well educated, I am well versed in all kinds of academics. But he says that in hindsight, as he's thinking about all the things that he's studied and all the things that he's learned, ultimately all of it is meaningless. All of it is meaningless. Now I want to clarify this because most of the people that are here right now are students. And let me say this, education is important. Right? So please do not take the sermon and walk away and say to your parents, Pastor YJ taught us that knowledge and education is meaningless, so I don't want to go to school. Do not be a high school dropout. Do not be a middle school dropout, please. Right? Stay in school. And the reason why I say that is because, number one, realistically, education is important because it is a requirement for most employment. Unless you're applying for your parents to work the rest of their lives and the rest of your life, you will need to get a job. Right? And if you want to get a job, the reality is education is usually a requirement. And these are the realities of education. Number one is education opens up doors because people look at your resume. The reality is that I am not that much smarter or that much better than anyone here, but I do get a lot more opportunities than most of you. Why? Because on my resume it will say Yale University. Right? And it opens up a lot of doors for me to talk to people that you normally won't get to, like getting to talk with the mayor, having access to the governor, right? Because they see that and think to themselves, oh, that's somebody I want to get counsel from, right? And the reality is, in my dialogues with many of you, I'm not really that much smarter than you. I'm really not that much more talented than you. But the truth is, education has opened up a lot of doors for me. We also know that education offers up opportunities of upward mobility. Why? Because the higher you want to get up towards a managerial or executive position, usually they're going to ask you for higher education, like a master's degree or some kind of doctoral degree. possibly as well, or some kind of MBA, things like that. And then finally, is education does allow for opportunities of networking. It is honestly by going to school and by getting to go to those kind of schools that I went to, it allowed me to meet people in areas and industries that otherwise I wouldn't have gotten to meet, and it allowed me to network with those kinds of people that help create opportunities of privilege so that I can help those who are underserved. And so let me make this very, very clear to you. Education is important, study hard, do well, and hopefully you can utilize those opportunities to better your lives as well as better the lives of others. But having said that, hopefully clearly, so don't be a dropout, having said that, there are things we should consider about what Solomon says. That in his journey towards obtaining all kinds of knowledge, he realizes that it was meaningless. So why does Solomon say that? And there's a couple of reasons why. Number one is this. He realizes that the systems of this world are always changing. Right? So the priorities and the systems of this world are always changing. So as soon as you're learning that this is what's important, you know what you're going to realize? Something else is important. Like me, I am way, way behind on your young people's lingo. By the time I catch up on what's cool, I find out that I am already behind, right? And the reality is that's what's happening in the world. Things are always changing, right? Things that we thought were cool are so yesterday, right? And so the world is always changing, and that's what Solomon began to realize. And so he's saying, man, I'm spending all this time trying to learn this, and by the time I learn it, it's irrelevant. It's meaningless, because now I have to learn something else. Secondly, what Solomon says as to why it's meaningless is that the knowledge of the systems of this world will reveal how corrupt the systems of this world are. Right? So knowledge of the systems of this world will reveal how corrupt the systems of this world are. And then finally is knowledge will create a desire for you to change the corruption of this world, but ultimately you'll realize how powerful you are to make any meaningful change. So let's examine these three things together. Number one, the systems of this world are always changing. Verse 14. Solomon was studying the systems of empires that were in power prior and even then at that time, because he's marrying into all these different kinds of cultures and different kinds of families, and different kind of royalty and different kind of empires. So he's trying to learn and be familiarized with all of them, right? But what he'll notice is that the power dynamics within each of these cultures and empires are constantly changing. Why? Because number one, the ruling emperor changes. So when I'm trying to understand that person and what they like and what things that they like to talk about, I find out that that person is not in power anymore, it's somebody else. Right? So the ruling emperor is constantly changing. Secondly is powerful empires are constantly overcoming one another. So when I thought the Egyptians were the great empire, I find out later on it's Mesopotamia. Later on I find out it's Macedonia. Like all these different empires are just constantly fighting and overcoming one another. And you can never really know which is the most powerful empire that I want to be in coalition with. And then finally, he realizes, is that when empires oftentimes also merge, or they become overcome and they become one greater empire. This is what happens later on with Persia. And because of that, there's a third hybrid culture. And we can kind of see that for us as well, right? Because for us as Korean Americans, most of us here are Korean Americans, right? We have a part of us that's a Korean culture and a part of us that's like an American culture, right? And so it's almost like a third culture because we're not fully Americanized culture, we're not fully Koreanized culture, and we're this third hybrid culture. We're a little bit of both. And that's something he also realizes that, man, it's always this hybrid cultures that are popping up as empires emerge, become united, become one, or one defeats another. And I'm constantly having to learn about another culture, another education, another thing to study. And the truth is, brothers and sisters, for us as well, we will also oftentimes find that this world does change so frequently. There are jobs that many of us would have wanted, maybe even 10 years ago, where people are saying that's not a good job to get, because the world is constantly changing. And the world is especially changing so fast because of something called the internet, right? Because the internet does several things. It allows cultures to adjust and learn more quickly. It allows different cultures to connect with each other, creating more hybrid cultures. It allows technology to make dramatic changes more quickly. The reality is the world changes even faster now than it did during Solomon's time. And for many of us, we oftentimes will feel that constant change, right? Because 10 years ago, 5 years ago, everybody would have told you the best thing to become as a Korean American is to become what? To become a doctor or to become a lawyer. And you know what most people will tell you now is that those are two markets that have become very oversaturated. Right? Everyone back then, when I was growing up in high school, everyone said you should become a pharmacist, right? And now you can't get a job in New York City because the pharmacy department is oversaturated. There are less and less pharmacies, too many pharmacy graduates. That's the reality that's happening. The world is constantly changing. Systems are constantly changing. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by this, because when I was amazed by this, because it's not that long ago, but when I grew up, when I saw this, can you go to the picture, please? When I saw this, every kid I knew what that was. Every kid. I was at a retreat not too long ago, and I asked them, do you know what that is? Do you know people don't know what that is anymore? It hasn't been that long, I know. It's so sad, right? People don't know what that is anymore. This is, for me growing up, the happiest place on earth, right? Other than Disney World, right? But people don't know what that is anymore because the world has changed so fast. Amazon has put it out of business, right? All these different things. And that's the hard things that we're kind of facing is that the systems of this world are constantly changing. And as people who are on the lower end, we're always feeling like we're just playing catch up, but never actually catching up. And so we too will feel like Solomon at times where we feel overwhelmed, we feel guilty, we feel like failures, and we feel like, man, all of this is becoming meaningless. Next, Solomon also reflects on how the knowledge of the systems of this world will reveal corruption of the systems of this world. So here's some things, and he especially talks about 17, but here's some things that Solomon says in this chapter about his journey of learning the systems of this world. He called it a burden. He says it caused him sorrow. It was full of grief. These are not positive words, right? He's saying that it was hard. It was heartbreaking. It was difficult. It was challenging. It was overwhelming, right? It caused him to be full of sorrow. It caused him to sometimes feel depressed. And many of us will feel that as well, that we too will oftentimes feel the sense of grief, the sense of hopelessness. Why? Because we are finding out the more we ingratiate ourselves into the systems of this world, that for us to succeed, many times it will feel like we have to also follow the patterns, the unethical patterns of this world. So let me give you examples of what I mean. These are literally people I know who have shared with me their journeys and their challenges and some of their sorrow. Friends of mine who are doctors. Alright? So I know somebody who I'm a close friend with. He was somebody who was in leadership with me. He's a heart surgeon. Right? He's a heart surgeon. He's head of his department in one of the hospitals here in New York City. And he was telling me how one of the challenges for himself was sometimes he'd have a patient, he'd meet with them and like, man, his heart's breaking for them as he's hearing their story. And he's like, man, I want to help this person, but the system of the hospital doesn't allow him to. Why? Because they will assess things about that person and say, wow, this person is someone who will likely or has a high chance of suing us. Right? There's a high likelihood that they might sue us, and because of that, they will deny or reject her procedure. Right? Because for the system of the hospital, the executive board, they're thinking about the cost of money. And for him as a doctor, obviously his desire is what? Is to want to help people, but there's a decision that's being made in terms of thinking more from the ethics of money and about the lawsuits rather than about saving this person's life. And he's constantly wrestling with this reality. And the more he would try to object or fight against that, you know what's going to happen to him is, you're not worth the trouble. Please leave, get out. And then he has to think about all the debt he's in from medical school. He has to think about his family that he has to provide for, his wife, his 3 children. Right? And he's talking about these things. The idea of the more and more I'm ingratiated into the medical system of this world, the more and more I'm grieving, the more and more I feel sorrow, right? As I find out how corrupt the medical system is in this nation. Friends of mine who are accountants and working from major accounting firms will tell me about their struggle as well. Why? Because in order for them to get that job, in order for them to get the best positions and get promoted, they always have to blur that line, figure out that line of telling the truth so that my client doesn't get audited, yet kind of lying so that they can get the most tax reduction possible, right? You can't be too truthful, because if you are, then obviously, this person's not getting as much money as they can, and if you don't lie a little bit, right, this person doesn't get as much money as possible. So you always have to balance getting audited versus getting as much money as possible, but they're constantly faced with the dilemma of having to tell half-truths. Always blurring that line of sort of telling a lie. And if they don't, the reality is, once again, you can be dismissed, they're not get promoted. And the more and more they're ingratiated into the systems of this world, they feel overwhelmed, feel grieved and depressed by how corrupt the systems of this world are. And I want to tell you the reality, even from their own stories, about the tension, what happens when we face this tension of our own personal ethics versus complying and following the ways of this world. Number one is that this kind of tension eventually takes a toll on us. At first we're like, I just got to do what I got to do to survive. But over the long haul, it usually takes a toll on us. Why? Because it will affect your heart. It will affect your ethics. You start to become very very dull, right? Or numb to the idea of ethics, what's right and wrong. Because you're always just thinking about what's going to be best for me. Next is that it will eventually affect your mental, emotional health. Because you're constantly thinking about this and wrestling with this, and it takes a mental and emotional toll. And usually that mental and emotional toll, because of stress, will affect your physical and spiritual life as well. So this tension will always affect you mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And usually what I find as well is, finally, it will affect your self-esteem. Why? Because even though you're trying to do what's right, the systems of this world will make you feel devalued and expendable. We don't need you. That's what happens. So many of us are struggling because we find ourselves in this tension, and we're working hard, but we feel like it's all meaningless because, man, the systems of this world is telling us, in order for you to become somebody, in order for you to become that person that you're dreaming and hoping and studying to be, this is what you gotta do, so you do it, except ultimately at the end, it makes you feel worthless and devalued. And as Solomon says, you wonder to yourself, is everything that I'm doing ultimately just meaningless? And this is the challenge, once again, this is another challenge that many of us will have to wrestle with. Finally, Solomon talks about how when you study the systems of this world, you will feel this desire for change, but you'll feel powerless to make any meaningful change. So there'll be this desire, you'll be like, man, something is wrong with the systems of this world, and I want to be a part of changing that, bringing change, right? So we can really help people. You'll have that desire to want to make changes, but ultimately you'll feel powerless to make any meaningful change. And Solomon describes his own journey to making changes, and these are the things that he says. What is crooked cannot be made straight. He says, man, when things are crooked, you can't help make it straight. He talks about how when applying the wisdom he has learned to make changes, it feels like you're just chasing after the wind. What does that mean? You're so busy working, but you feel like you produced nothing. Right? Because you're running around, being busy, working hard, but you have produced nothing. And this is what Solomon describes his own journey as he's desired to want to make changes. And so in evaluating all of this, I think it's important for us to learn, once again, from Solomon's life, because we don't want to just feel depressed. We don't like, oh man, Solomon, I feel you. I'm the same way. I get what you're talking about, and it really is depressing. Because the point of Solomon's intention is not to depress you, but to help you feel convicted, to learn from his mistakes. So some things that we can learn from are this. Let's evaluate Solomon's life and journey to make those changes, right? So first of all, one of the things we have to look at is this. His father David had a council of advisors, but you know what's interesting about Solomon when you read through the book of Kings? Is that Solomon really never trusted anyone other than himself. So David had this council of trusted advisors. He had this council of people that he trusted and believed and had lived life and journeyed through hardship with, and he truly, fully trusted them. And he trusted and submitted to their words that they would share with him. But Solomon trusted who? Himself. Nobody's smarter than me. Nobody's more wiser than me. I am the one who knows best. And he trusted himself only. Later on in life, he goes through an opposite extreme, which is what? That he trusted everybody. Every wife that had something to say, he had to listen to them and give it credence. And neither of those things are very healthy. And so I want to challenge you with learning from David versus Solomon. Think about these questions. Do we know how to work with others? Just really ask yourselves that. Do we know how to work with others? Do we know how to trust them? Do we know how, when they are saying something that maybe we disagree with, do we know how to listen? Do we know how to consider? And sometimes, even if you are the leader, do you know how to submit? Because they see things that you might not see. Right? Do you trust them? So question number one is, do we know how to work with others? If you don't know how to work with others, you are in the process or in the journey of being like Solomon, which is you're trying to make meaningful change, but in your own power, in your own way. And meaningful change is very rarely a solo project. Okay, you actually go to the slide before, sorry. Okay? Next thing is this, okay? Trusting in yourself is a form of pride. Trusting in yourself is a form of pride. If the only person or the person you most trust is yourself, it is a form of pride. Why? Because there's an areas of thinking that you always know better than everyone else. Right? And it's a form of pride. And it does not allow for healthy growth or healthy change. Why? Because the Bible is very clear. Pride always leads to downfall and destruction. When you are building a system of change that's built on pride, it will always lead to downfall and destruction. It will lead to only a different kind of unhealthy change. And so you will accomplish the very opposite of what you're seeking to do. And that's what I share with you as you look at Solomon's life later on. Here's some things that Solomon does. Is he begins to make treaties and pacts with every nation possible. Right? Because he's like, man,